So today I'm going to be presenting a recent paper of ours. This was joint work with Liz Kreitz, Sarah Meiklejohn and Rebecca Mercer. And in this paper, our aim was to formalize a cryptographic model of token curated registries. And I will explain what those are. I don't expect you to know what those are in advance in a sec. We provided a provably secure construction, and we also demonstrated concurrent security, only in the print version though, not in the journal version. The main focus of this talk is going to be slightly different from the main focus of the paper. And in particular, I'm going to be discussing some challenges and solutions that we came across while trying to get provable security. These are no doubt sort of challenges that lots of people have came across and come up with lots of solutions before, but nonetheless, it caused us such a headache that it's something I wanted to talk about and maybe enlighten people. So there's going to be quite a few topics covered in this talk, so I will occasionally sort of bring back this outlined slide to let you know where we are. First, I'll just define and motivate token curated registries, as that's what we're trying to build. Then I will discuss the construction that we came up with and why we believe it to be sound. Then I will highlight two challenges which come up when you're trying to prove things in the random oracle model. And finally, I will present solutions to each of these challenges. Not the only solutions, but our solutions. So the ultimate goal of a token curated registry is to create a high quality list of items that users can trust in a decentralized manner. So using a fairly British example here, it's not so different from trying to build the yellow pages on a blockchain. We want to be able to have reputable businesses or other items, maybe news stories is a classic one, being sort of maintained in such a way that when people access them, they know they're accessing something real. But we don't want it to be the case that this list is being maintained by a single trusted party. We want it to be the case that it's maintained by lots of parties that have some reputation at stake in the game, but who still have some level of sort of trust involved. You can't just sort of become a member of the list. You can't just maintain this list randomly, but equally it's not just one person. So we have three members. We have curators, people in charge of maintaining the list. We have members, people who are seeking to be part of the list. And we have users who are using the list. Sorry. So to sort of illustrate it again, one situation where you might use these things is for trying to prevent the spread of false news. You might want it to have a list of true news articles which are being maintained in some public list. And in order to join the list, you ask the curators to add your item to the list. The curators will then vote on whether or not they think it is something which belongs on the list. And if the curators vote correctly, i.e. with the majority, enough times, then they'll gain more weight in the system, so their votes will count for more. So really what we're presenting is not so different from a boardroom voting protocol. By boardroom voting, we do not mean national election voting. We actually think that the problem we're trying to cover here is much easier. For a start, we can assume that there are incentives in place to guarantee participation. And we also believe that the risks attached if things go wrong are significantly lower. Like, don't get me wrong, if you do have fake news being sort of kept on this respected list, that's not great, but it's not equivalent to the fall of democracy. Hopefully. We know of two current TCRs which are running on the Ethereum blockchain. One is by consensus. It's a partial lock commit reveal scheme. And this is very efficient in nature, but it doesn't hide the contents of the curator's votes, which we thought was a bit of a problem. The other is one by Enigma, which not only sort of hides the content of the curator's votes, it also provides some method of bribery resistance, which is not something that we were able to cover, but it does rely on trusted hardware, and we don't rely on trusted hardware. So when defining what do we even mean, what security properties do we want to get when we are presenting a scheme, we considered that there were two important properties, and we were quite proud of the definitions we came up with eventually, but for the sake of this talk, I'm not going to go into them other than on the high level. And to say that with dispute freeness, this is our soundness notion, the idea that you can't deviate from the protocol, you can't make the list accept something when most of the curators said no. And the other property we wanted to achieve was vote secrecy, being that an adversary should learn nothing from the transcript except what the final vote is. So they shouldn't learn the individual votes. We also achieve self-tallying. So we don't require any third party to count the votes. This, you can compute the vote naturally once every party has voted. But we do not achieve receipt freeness, which is this bribery resistant notion that I was talking about before. So I'm now going to present our construction. We ran in 2 rounds. In the first round, the curators are going to provide an encryption of the vote. In the second round, they're also going to provide an encryption of the vote, but this encryption is not going to be just a randomized Al-Gamal encryption. It's going to be a deterministic value which is computed based on all of the other votes in the first round. The votes from the second round can all be summed together in order to get the final vote in the exponent, but we're assuming that there's quite a small number of people voting, so it should be the case that you can brute force that actual tally. And the terms in our second round, the randomized terms, are all going to cancel out, which is why we're able to get that final tally. So the tricks that we're using for this self-tallying property are not new, not ours. We found them in a paper from Howe et al. Our actual construction is a little bit different because we weren't able to prove the Howe et al. Protocol concurrently secure. So we had to change the scheme a little bit in order to get that proof to go through. We're also going to require that the curators provide a zero knowledge proof in both rounds that they have behaved honestly. And the reason is that we need to achieve dispute freeness, the idea that an adversary cannot deviate from the protocol. And really this part was very easy because we have these zero knowledge proofs. So if the party cheats in the first round, then you won't be able to generate the zero knowledge proof. So you know in the first round that every encryption is a valid encryption of a vote. And in the second round, the zero knowledge proof is going to prove that the encrypted value is the same as the encrypted value in the first round. Put the two together and you're not going to be able to cheat that. Oh, and if you combine it with vote secrecy, the idea that you don't learn anything from the transcript about the vote, you also avoid front-running attacks. Because in the first round you don't learn anything, and in the second round you have to stick with what you committed to in the first round, you can't then change your vote depending on how other people have voted. Okay, now I'm going to get to the sort of real meat of the talk, which is the challenges that we came across when trying to prove vote secrecy. This proof was deceptively hard. It doesn't look easy, but we spent actually several months on it, finding many different reasons why certainly different proofs that we'd found in the literature didn't really work once you tried to go through things formally. So the general strategy for this, and one that you'll find lots of sort of proof sketches of, is to do a hybrid jumping scenario. So you start with your vote secrecy game, and you're going to gradually sort of change the game in such a way that the adversary can't notice until you end up in a statistically impossible game, which you can argue is statistically impossible. So of course the adversary can't win that. In the first game, you're going to replace the real zero knowledge proofs with simulated zero knowledge proofs. In the second game, you're going to replace the encryptions with random values. In the next bit, you're going to replace the encryptions in the second round with random values that sum correctly. And then because all you have is simulated proofs and random values, you have no advantage in figuring out how people voted. And this all goes through very nicely if you have standard model zero knowledge proofs, but we don't. We have zero knowledge proofs which are secure in the random oracle model, which we want to keep using for efficiency reasons. They're the most efficient in our setting. I don't know how familiar people are with the random oracle model, but I'm just sort of going to go through it quite quickly. The idea of this model is that you're making assumptions about hash functions. We're making assumptions about hash functions actually which we know are not correct, but that we believe are good enough in order to say that our security proof should hold in the real world. So in the real world, your hash function is going to be something like SHA-256, maybe rescue, maybe Keka. And you have that given the same input, the hash function always returns the same output. In the random oracle model world, the hash function is assumed to be a truly random function. Again, though, if you give it the same input, it should always return the same output. We know that the random oracle model isn't actually true, but equally we've never come up with any protocol, well, any, there's a couple of examples which are like quite pathological, but any sort of proper example in the random oracle model which doesn't hold in the real world that we've been able to break. But actually when we're proving this scheme, we need something stronger. We need the programmable random oracle model. So here the hash function is not just assumed to be random, but it's assumed that there is an external party that can control the hash function. It can, given an input, program the oracle to return a specific output, provided that that output looks random. And this introduces two problems when it comes to security proofs. The first problem is what happens if the reduction is required to program the oracle twice at the same point. What happens is that your reduction fails, but you need to argue that this doesn't happen, which can be quite a complicated argument when you have lots of different moving parts. The second issue which you can come across is that the reduction might be asked to rewind the adversary in multiple different sessions. And if this happens, then the reduction that people come up with would typically run in exponential time, which again is a faulty reduction. So here I'm going to point to, I would say, one of my favorite papers at the moment, which discusses these problems in quite a lot more detail. It introduces a restricted random oracle model, which is where it talks about how you can still program this oracle, but that if you're trying to program this oracle when you're simulating honest parties, you shouldn't be able to do that. So the solutions we came up with to our first challenge were probably the most standard solutions, but again, we came across an open problem, so I am going to present it. So remember the setting again, we're doing these hybrid game swapping. In the first step, we're going to replace the real zero knowledge proofs with simulated zero knowledge proofs. But in order to avoid having to argue about how the simulator doesn't program the same point twice, we're going to just avoid having the simulator program full stop. The methods for which we do this are, there are actually some papers that prove that this technique works in the non-programmable random oracle model. I can't remember what they are at the moment. But basically you have to introduce a common reference string, a set of random parameters that all parties know. And in this sort of ideal vote secrecy world, rather than sort of actually have the common reference string being random, we're going to instead embed a trapdoor in that common reference string. And then the simulator can say, either the statement is true or the trapdoor exists, and because the simulator has the trapdoor, they're not actually at all concerned about whether or not the statement is true. So the reason this doesn't go through quite as nicely as we thought it would, initially we were sort of quite excited about this. We thought we were going to be able to prove our thing in the non-programmable random oracle model, get it as close to the standard model as we could. But actually, we don't know how to provide a simulation sound sigma protocol without programming. We know how to produce a sound, statistically sound even sigma protocol without programming, but the moment we want it to be simulation sound, we run into issues. So sort of to explain this in a bit more detail, if we have an adversary that we know cannot prove false statements, then this is great. But we also now have a simulator that can prove false statements. We need it to prove false statements for our reduction to go through. And the adversary is now going to see these proofs for false statements. It won't know that the statements are false, but it will see the proofs and it will see the statements. So we then need to argue that the adversary cannot use these proofs in order to generate more proofs for more false statements that we haven't seen before. We didn't know how to do this without programming, so what we did is we programmed, but carefully. So the problem that I'm presenting here is it possible to construct a simulation sound sigma protocol in the non-programmable random oracle model? Okay, the second challenge which we came across is probably one which there are less solutions to in the literature, although I'm sure there's some. And that's what happens if the reduction is asked to rewind the adversary in multiple sessions. Again, we have our game. In our round 2, our honest party is going to have to generate some ciphertexts which look like the ciphertext that the honest party would produce. And the simulator isn't necessarily going to be able to do this on its own. So because we're hopping between games, we're occasionally introducing hardness games like the DDH assumption. So we're going to receive as input some ABC group elements with unknown exponents, and we're going to be trying to like embed them into our game. But then we're also going to have to be computing additional elements based on these group elements with unknown exponents, based on the outputs that the adversary gives. And the things that we need from the adversary in this situation would be the field elements. But the moment you want to extract field elements from the adversary, you have to use special soundness. You have to rewind twice in order to get each field element. And this becomes a problem in terms of keeping things running in polynomial time. So we don't do this. What we instead do is we put an extra element in our common reference string. And so this is a change of construction. And we additionally have the prover give this random element to the power of its secret and a proof of correctness so that it can't cheat that. Then in the reduction, the simulator does actually have the extra information that it needs. Sure, it doesn't have X, but it has a to the power of xi, and it has this for every single adversary. So it's every single output the adversary gives. So it's able to compute the linear combination of these values that it needs in order to simulate CI4. So to summarize that, vote security proofs are tougher than they look. They're not something which you should hand wave, because when you actually get down to the nitty-gritty details, you often find that things don't go through as nicely as you thought they would. By using the random oracle model, we're able to provide a protocol which is practical enough to run on the Ethereum blockchain. I think we were estimating about 20 cents per transaction at the time when we were writing it. I can't remember how we got that number. And by restricting our use of programmable oracles where possible, we can also prove concurrent security. This idea that if you have lots of the protocol running at the same time, you still get security. In conclusion, token curated registries provide respectable sources of information on the blockchain. We constructed a concurrently secure, dispute-free and vote secret TCR. Security proofs in the random oracle model must ensure that the same 2 points are never programmed, and they should also be careful that they run in polynomial time. Thank you very much.